Hey friends, tonight we're slipping back into the shadows of the Middle Ages, not to study knights or castles, but to uncover the bizarre, unsettling, and strangely sincere things people truly believed. From walls that whispered sins to bells that rang when someone thought impure thoughts, medieval life was anything but ordinary. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy strange history as much as I do. Drop a comment with your location and the time you're watching. It's always surreal seeing who's drifting off with us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's step into a world where superstition ruled the night. The cathedral walls that trapped voices of the unforgiven. Imagine yourself stepping into a medieval cathedral at dusk. The air is cool and hushed. The stone beneath your feet has held centuries of footsteps. The walls, immense, time-worn, and cold to the touch, stretch upward into vaulted ribs that disappear into shadow. High above, stained glass filters the last light of day into long, faded streams of red and gold across the flagstones. But here, in the deep silence of the nave, some claimed you could hear more than just echoes of footsteps. They said the stone itself remembered. Not just the chant of monks or the solemn hush of mass, but whispers, fragments, remnants of those who had come to unburden themselves and failed. In many cathedrals of Europe, particularly in France and England during the 12th to 14th centuries, there were quiet stories, passed mostly among the devout, the desperate, and the curious, that the walls of the cathedral could absorb sound, much like they absorbed light. That a confession not truly repented, a sin unshriven, a secret kept too long, could linger in the stones. Some pilgrims believed that if you pressed your ear to the wall, especially after Vespers in the hours before dawn, you might hear a murmur, soft and sorrowful. Not quite a word, not quite a name, but the shape of regret. It was never doctrine. The church itself discouraged superstition. But the medieval mind moved differently. Mystery, faith, and daily reality were intertwined. Cathedrals weren't just places of worship, they were thresholds. Portals between heaven and earth, between flesh and spirit, and in that liminal space, many believed certain things became possible. To understand this belief, we must enter not only the building, but the lives of the people who sought it out. For much of medieval life, confession was not only religious practice, it was spiritual survival. The soul, as they believed, needed to be scrubbed clean of sin before death. To die with an unconfessed sin was to risk eternal punishment, or at the very least, a long and burning wait in purgatory. And yet, confession was not always possible. Priests were not always near. And some sins, so deeply rooted in shame, betrayal, or violence, could not be spoken aloud. So what happened to those who came to the cathedral, knelt at the stone, and couldn't bring themselves to speak? There were whispers, again, this time among the clergy, that the stones took in those silent sorrows. That the souls who had failed to confess would sometimes return. Not in body, but in sound. As echoes. As faint, mournful phrases repeating in the nave, or curling down the ambulatory behind the altar. One chronicler, a monk writing in 1327 in the Low Countries, noted in his Marginalia a strange custom. Pilgrims placing their ears to the north transept wall of a cathedral, where many have said the stones speak. He did not confirm nor deny its truth, only that it happened often enough to be worthy of note. And there were architectural features that may have reinforced the idea. Certain cathedrals were designed with hidden acoustic qualities. Whispering galleries, curved apses where a voice could travel unnaturally far. In places like Ely Cathedral or the octagonal chapter house at York, a soft word uttered at one end could carry to the other as if it were being spoken directly in your ear. To someone unfamiliar with the phenomenon, the effect could be uncanny, mysterious, even divine. Some of these pilgrims, especially those who had suffered loss or carried guilt, believed that these echoes were not accidental. They were messages, perhaps from the dead, perhaps from the stone itself. And here, we find another dimension to the belief, not just that the walls recorded sins, but that they bore witness to suffering, to loneliness, to the confessions that never made it to human ears. In a time when literacy was rare, privacy was scarce, and emotion was tightly bound by doctrine, the idea that stone could hold your secrets might have been strangely comforting. There are stories of widows returning yearly to the same column in Chartres, whispering prayers, not to saints, but to lost husbands. Of former soldiers who sat for hours against the eastern walls of Reims, as if waiting for a reply. Of stonemasons who claimed, quietly, that certain blocks hummed if the sun hit them just right. Not loud. Just a resonance. A tone that did not belong to wind or bird or bell. Of course, we might explain it differently now. Thermal expansion. Subtle acoustics. The natural amplification of sound in vaulted ceilings and stone cloisters. But in the rhythm of medieval life, such explanations would have seemed pale beside the lived experience of mystery. To them, these echoes were part of a living world. A sacred world. Even the ritual of confession itself had architectural echoes. In early medieval times, confession was often public, spoken aloud in the nave. Later, it became private, whispered through a lattice in a small chapel. But always, the voice moved through wood or stone and into silence. And perhaps it was in that silence that people imagined the stone listening. Not maliciously, but patiently, like a monk in perpetual vigil. You might wonder, did anyone ever truly hear a voice? A name? A sentence repeated? No surviving chronicle says so directly. The closest we come are moments of ambiguity. A 15th century scribe in Norwich notes that, on certain nights, the old cathedral murmurs, as though in prayer. A curious phrasing, too poetic for accident. But again, neither confirmation nor denial. And perhaps that is the point, that the silence of stone offers just enough space for the imagination to project into it. That in these walls, massive, ancient, and unyielding, people saw something permanent enough to hold what they could not carry anymore. Regret, guilt, memory. And so they leaned in, pressed their ear to the cold flint or limestone, closed their eyes, and waited. Sometimes they heard nothing, sometimes only the wind through clerestory windows. But occasionally, just occasionally, they swore they heard something soft. Something shaped like words but older. Not quite Latin, not quite pain. A whisper, perhaps, from someone long dead, or someone never truly gone. Stone does not forgive, but it remembers. And in the great cathedrals of Europe, the faithful walked beneath its weight, hoping that memory, carved in rib and column, whispered through echo and silence, might one day become absolution. Even if no one was listening, even if no voice answered back, only the stone remained. And the silence it held was never quite empty. Not entirely. The tapestries that changed shape when lies were told. Imagine yourself in a quiet chamber lit only by wavering candlelight. The fire in the hearth crackles low, shadows stretching lazily across thick stone walls. The air is heavy with the scent of beeswax, old wool, and dried herbs hung from beams above. Somewhere nearby, the soft rustle of movement, silk brushing against velvet, perhaps, or the subtle shift of boots against rushes on the floor. But what draws the eye is not the fire, nor the flicker of gold thread in a noble's tunic. It is the tapestry. It hangs across the far wall, floor to ceiling, a dense weave of color and symbol. Winding vines in 1,000 shades of green curl around towers, trees, and antlered beasts. Birds nest in upper corners. Figures, some mythic, some strangely human, move through intricate woodland scenes. And though you stare and stare, you cannot quite say whether the stag in the corner always had red eyes, or whether that vine by the maiden's feet was curled differently before. This is the heart of the tale. A whispered superstition, once taken so seriously that nobles grew pale when they were asked to speak under its gaze. They believed the tapestry could change, not with weather or time, but with deceit. If a lie was spoken in its presence, the story went, the tapestry would shift, just a little. A serpent would blink where there had been none. A beast would open its jaws. Or a flower, once closed, would bloom blood-red. It wasn't every tapestry, only certain ones. Woven under specific circumstances, or in the presence of particular monks, or commissioned with such strange care that people said something had settled into them. An awareness. A silent watcher. You can find references to them in court records, visitor accounts, and even sermons. They are often called the truth-weaving hangings, the unshriven cloths, or simply, the watching threads. No one could agree exactly when the belief began, but by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the legend had taken hold in certain noble households from France to Bohemia. A guest at Château de Clerval, writing in 1319, noted with unease that the tapestry in the Great Hall regarded us silently, and yet none dared speak falsehood near it. Another, this time a clerk from the court of Burgundy, described how his lord would pace before the hanging before negotiations, murmuring truths to it, as though priming it to notice any lies that might follow. Tapestries, of course, were more than decoration. In a cold stone castle, they held warmth. Literally, they held warmth, trapping heat against the walls. But they also served political and spiritual purposes. They told stories, biblical tales, Arthurian myths, dynastic histories, and moral warnings woven in silk and wool. To hang a tapestry was to hang your values in plain view. And sometimes your secrets. Some of the so-called shifting tapestries bore clear allegorical scenes. Justice and injustice as women with scales and knives, the Garden of Eden with subtle additions, or Judgment Day framed by blooming vines. But many were subtler. They depicted no clear story, only tangled nature. Paths through forests, ruins overgrown with ivy, animals just emerging from shadows. The kind of image that seemed alive already. The kind of image that encouraged projection. And that is likely part of the answer. We know today that intricate patterns, especially those with organic shapes and repeating detail, can trigger subtle visual illusions in the human brain. Long exposure to such imagery, particularly in low light or flickering firelight, can cause the eye to perceive motion where there is none. Add to this a room full of tense, silent listeners, perhaps in the midst of a political oath or a disputed inheritance, and the conditions are perfect. Not for magic, perhaps, but for belief. There were even rumors of tapestries made deliberately for this effect, woven with threads that caught light differently depending on angle, or designed with such complex mirrored forms that staring at them too long could unsettle even the steadiest viewer. And if a noble's hall had such a piece, especially one with known legend attached, it would become part of the household theater. A silent enforcer of honesty. Did people truly believe the tapestry shifted? Some did. Others, perhaps, only said they did. But belief has a way of behaving like reality, especially when reinforced by fear and tradition. Servants whispered about it behind doors. Children were warned not to lie near it. And when a visitor faltered mid-sentence, glancing at the wall behind them, the silence that followed was often more powerful than any accusation. The psychological effect, we might say, was the tapestry's true power. But not all observers were comforted by that explanation. One letter from 1472, preserved in the correspondence of a minor noblewoman near Ghent, describes how she swore an oath of fidelity in front of such a tapestry, and immediately saw the eyes of the woven fox turn black. She fled the room in tears. Others described subtler experiences, hearing faint rustling behind the fabric, feeling watched, or sensing the room grow colder when dishonesty was near. These are not facts, but they are history, because they shaped behavior. Tapestries became more than warmth or wealth. They were guardians. They were tests. In a world where truth could determine inheritance, war, or excommunication, even the suggestion that the wall might betray you was enough to change how people spoke. Eventually, as Enlightenment thinking spread and superstition lost its public foothold, these stories faded. The hangings were passed down, cut up for cushions, or lost in the churn of revolutions. But a few remain. Quiet, anonymous survivors in museums and old churches. No label warns you. No plaque mentions the legend. They are just woodland scene, 15th century, or floral border with hunt motif. But if you were to stand in front of one, long enough, in flickering light, you might begin to wonder, was that stag always watching? Or did it just turn its head? The castle gates that would refuse entry to the unworthy. Imagine approaching a medieval castle in the late afternoon, the sky overcast and heavy with the scent of damp stone and wood smoke. The path beneath your feet is uneven, rounded cobbles worn smooth by the passing of many hooves and boots. The wind catches the banners hanging above the battlements, their faded colors lifting gently as if exhaling. And before you, the gate. Tall, imposing, built not only of timber and iron but also of custom and caution, the castle gate was more than just an entryway. In many regions, it was said to judge. And sometimes, according to chroniclers and scattered letters from stewards and scribes, it refused. The accounts are few, subtle, and never the focus of royal chronicles. Instead, they hide in margins, strange little notes by clerks, monks, and lesser nobles. The gate did not raise. The chains failed without damage. The portcullis stood still, though all else was in order. These comments, often brushed aside today as mechanical failure or superstition, once carried significant weight. In a time before standardized repairs or mechanical diagnostics, every failure held symbolic potential. And for the deeply religious minds of the time, especially in 12th and 13th century Europe, any unexpected malfunction was rarely treated as accidental, especially if the visitor in question had enemies, a reputation for cruelty, or came bearing demands rather than gifts. Some castles were said to possess a kind of awareness, not alive in any modern sense, but imbued with centuries of loyalty and betrayal, peace and bloodshed, vows kept and promises broken. They were built on land that had held centuries of history before the first stone was laid. Their wood came from sacred groves. Their foundations often rested near forgotten shrines or burial mounds. All of this, combined with the medieval tendency to see the world through signs and portents, meant that a jammed gate was rarely just a jammed gate. In one record from 1311, a guest arrived at a minor noble estate in Brittany seeking favor and safe harbor. He was wealthy, carried gifts, and was expected. Yet when the drawbridge was lowered, it halted partway. The chains, examined afterward, showed no breakage. Servants tried again. Nothing moved. Only after the guest departed, on foot, insulted and confused, did the gate move freely once more. The Lord, according to later notes, was privately relieved. He had doubted the man's intentions. The castle, he believed, had confirmed them. These stories rarely made it into public retellings. Castles were tools of power, not spiritual oracles. But among the staff, gatekeepers, squires, washerwomen, and cooks, these tales were passed on, not with awe, but quiet understanding. They believed that a place so steeped in history could carry a memory, that the castle itself might recognize threat not by weapon, but by spirit. Gate mechanics, of course, were prone to error. Timber swelled with rain. Pulleys froze in winter. Rats chewed ropes. But there is something about how consistently these refusals occurred during politically tense visits or with unpopular guests that makes the pattern worth noting. Interestingly, many castles had what might be called emotional architecture. Their design reflected not just defense, but status and mood. A gate that creaked open slowly, reluctantly, was a message in itself, especially when the entire reception party had been arranged, and yet no one could get the chains to move. Some lords even used such incidents as political excuses. We could not receive you. The gate would not allow it. It was a polite rejection wrapped in mysticism. Even in castles with no recorded refusals, there was still an awareness that the gate was a threshold, not only physical but symbolic. It marked the point where outside became inside, where trust, even if temporary, was extended. To cross a castle's gate was not merely a matter of geography. It meant something was being offered, and when that gate wouldn't move, it meant something was being denied. Architecturally, gate systems could be surprisingly sophisticated. Counterweights, ratchets, gears, and human-operated windlasses kept the heavy doors moving. But they were also vulnerable to subtle failure. Small misalignments, swollen joints, or frayed cords could bring the entire system to a halt. The belief that these failures had intention, however, tells us more about the people than the gates. Medieval people saw meaning everywhere. Comets, birthmarks, withered crops. It was not foolishness. It was survival through attention. If you could find signs in the world, you could prepare. So when a gate refused to open, even after all had been prepared, It was easier to believe the structure had spoken than to accept random failure. Over time, the idea of places with judgment faded. By the Renaissance, reason and mechanics took precedence over whispers and omens. But even then, some architects still built gates to feel felt, to impose pause. The grand archways of later palaces echoed the earlier belief. A gateway is not only about access, it's about intention. So imagine again, standing before the gate. You've traveled far. You've done nothing wrong. But still, something in the air feels tense. The chain grinds. The wind shifts. And then, silence. The gate does not rise. No one speaks. In that moment you are left to wonder, was it the rope, the pulley, or something deeper? Something not about what you carry, but about who you are? The castle, after all, remembers. And sometimes it decides. The chimneys where evil spirits hid among the smoke. Imagine yourself seated near the hearth of a stone manor, the fire crackling low, casting gentle shadows across uneven walls. The chimney above groans softly as the wind presses against the roof. Then, without warning, a plume of black soot drifts downward. Not much, just a faint sprinkle that settles on the table's linen and across the back of someone's tunic. No one speaks. A glance is exchanged. Somewhere in the back of the room, a servant crosses themselves and murmurs a prayer beneath their breath. In medieval and early modern Europe, chimneys were more than mere architectural features. They were strange vertical passageways that pierced the boundary between inside and out, safety and storm, sacred and infernal. And in a world thick with belief, both sanctioned by the church and whispered among common folk, those boundaries were anything but secure. The hearth was the soul of a household. Its fire provided heat, light, and warmth for food. But the chimney, the flue that pulled smoke upward, was a mystery. It reached into the unseen sky, a place associated both with heaven and with chaotic winds. Chimneys didn't exist in the earliest homes. For centuries, smoke simply spilled through holes in the roof or drifted from side slits high on the walls. When vertical chimneys became widespread around the 12th to 14th centuries, they were seen as a marvel, but also as an intrusion, an unknown space that cut through the home. The idea that evil might nestle there, waiting, was not entirely metaphorical. People genuinely believed spirits could travel along smoke. In some regions, funeral rites involved careful handling of fire and air, lest the spirit of the dead become trapped or misdirected. And so it was not hard to imagine that something could come down instead. Smoke, with its twisting, erratic movements, was thought to carry not just particles but presences. In parts of rural France and the German states, folktales described chimney imps or smoke devils, small creatures said to nestle in the upper flue, invisible unless disturbed. Their presence was often blamed when food spoiled suddenly or a log collapsed too quickly into ash. If soot tumbled down at an unlucky moment, say, during a child's birth or a solemn oath, some believed it was a sign that something unseen disapproved. Such beliefs existed alongside a more formal cosmology upheld by the church. In that system, demons were real, but they were often thought to act through temptation and spiritual weakness. Still, the church never fully stamped out folk belief. In fact, in some cases, it absorbed it. There were official blessings for chimneys in certain regions, and priests were occasionally called to perform minor rites to cleanse the flue when soot fell persistently. This mixture of faith and folklore crept into domestic routines. For example, it was not uncommon for older women in the household, especially grandmothers or widows, to quietly whisper a protective charm when tending the hearth. These were not spells in any overt sense. More often, they were simple rhymes or phrases handed down through generations. A few embers arranged just so, a pattern of ash brushed into a spiral, subtle gestures meant to keep the smoke straight and the spirits appeased. You might imagine a medieval cook, sleeves rolled, face streaked with sweat, glancing upward nervously as the fire roars beneath a heavy cauldron. If the wind shifts and sends the smoke back into the room, it isn't just inconvenient, it's ominous. Perhaps an ancestor wasn't properly buried. Perhaps someone has lied nearby, and the smoke recognizes the deceit. In more affluent homes, blackened hearths were signs of use, but soot that refused to clear might prompt concern. Guests noted it. Servants gossiped. A chimney that groaned at night could make sleep uneasy. There are scattered records in estate rolls of chimney sweeps being called not merely to clean, but to search, a word that appears ambiguous, perhaps intentionally. Search for blockage. Or something else. This suspicion turned practical over time. As chimneys grew taller and more complex in noble estates, cleaning them became dangerous work. Young boys, some as young as 6, were sent into flues to scrub and scrape. In England especially, the chimney sweep became an iconic figure, often covered in soot, emerging ghost-like from the interior of the home. Some believed their soot-covered hands could bring luck if they touched your arm on New Year's Day. But others feared them too. After all, who else went up into that hidden space? During the long winters, when chimneys smoked continuously and the upper flues choked with residue, accidents were frequent. Flare-ups, collapses, and always the risk that something might descend. A bird, a snake, or just a puff of ash with no clear source. In those moments, belief filled the gaps. Evil traveled in uncertainty, and soot was its calling card. Guests at feasts sometimes watched the fire more than the entertainment. If a gust of black smoke pushed its way into the hall, disrupting the flickering candles, many would pause mid-bite. Not dramatically, just for a breath. A prayer might be mouthed but never spoken. Saying it aloud would admit fear, and that gave the spirits power. In towns, especially during outbreaks of illness, smoke was both blamed and sought as remedy. Physicians might recommend sweet-smelling herbs burned in the hearth to ward off miasmas. But if a home's chimney sputtered or refused to draw, it was whispered that evil had already taken hold. Even architectural guides from the Renaissance include curious lines advising never to leave a flue unfinished, for what enters may not leave. Today, these beliefs seem distant. Chimneys are inspected with tools, their draft measured by engineers. But in some older homes, the flues remain narrow, soot-lined, and crooked. Sometimes when a fire is lit in winter, and the house creaks with settling, and a soft wisp of soot drifts unexpectedly into the air, you might catch yourself glancing up. Not in fear, just in memory, of a time when smoke wasn't just smoke. When the hearth warmed your hands, but the chimney watched you back. The painted ceilings that showed hidden sins at midnight. Imagine yourself stepping into the guest chamber of a 15th century noble estate, its stone walls cool to the touch, draped in faded tapestries. The air smells faintly of wax and lime wash. You look up, and the ceiling above you seems to shimmer faintly in the low candlelight. Rows of painted angels and saints gaze serenely down from the beams. By day, they are merely decoration, beautiful, distant, almost forgotten. But at night, with the candles flickering and shadows breathing across the plaster, some guests whispered that the eyes of the figures opened. Not metaphorically, but literally. In certain corners of Europe, especially in parts of Italy, southern France, and Bohemia, painted ceilings became a quiet obsession of the late medieval and early Renaissance period. These weren't just ornamental panels. They were narrative frescoes meant to be read from below, as if the room itself were watching you sleep. Scenes of biblical judgment, rows of the pious saved, and the grotesque condemned spiraled across the rafters. And in more than a few places, records suggest that these ceilings carried a heavier weight than decoration alone. According to a 1497 chronicle from the Languedoc region, one noble's guest chamber was avoided by even his closest friends. The ceiling, it was said, had been commissioned by a devout but suspicious grandmother who believed sin left invisible stains. She insisted the angels be painted with soulsight, a symbolic term used by the local painters guild to describe figures whose gaze appeared to follow viewers no matter where they stood. The saints were given fine silver leaf eyes, which caught and reflected candlelight unevenly. As the flames wavered, so too did the direction of their stare. Now, there is nothing magical in silver leaf or mineral pigments. The science of eye-following illusions in paintings is well known. But the effect at the time, in rooms otherwise dim and alive with the rustle of night, could be unsettling. Guests described a sensation of being watched. Some refused to undress beneath the painted stairs. Others, after a night spent tossing under the silent gaze of the ceiling, confessed old wrongs in whispered tones. just to the air, or perhaps to the saints themselves. The idea that sacred images could detect falsehood or sin was not confined to painted ceilings. Across Christendom, images were believed to sweat, weep, bleed, or cloud over when dishonesty entered a room. In Italy, it was common for judges to convene in halls where frescoes of the Last Judgment loomed above. The belief wasn't that justice could be enforced by brushstroke, but that the mere presence of the divine helped remind men of their mortality and fallibility. But ceilings had a unique intimacy. Unlike a painting on a wall, which you could walk past, a ceiling watched you when you were most vulnerable, sleeping, lying flat on your back, eyes open, staring up into the gaze of eternity. There is a curious record from an estate inventory in 1521, listing the fresco of the Midnight Eyes among the valuables of a small Hungarian castle. No image of this artwork survives, but it was described in a traveler's note from the same period as containing 12 saints, each with eyes that glimmer like dew in the moonlight, turning toward any who have lied in the room. The phrasing is vague, likely poetic, but the legend persisted. Later accounts from the region claim that when liars slept beneath the painting, they would dream of judgment and wake drenched in sweat. Of course, modern historians often attribute such tales to clever psychological design. When a room is dimly lit and filled with symbolic eyes, the mind, especially a guilty one, fills in the gaps. The ceiling doesn't need to move for the guest to believe it has. Candlelight is unpredictable. Minds are restless. And guilt lingers. Yet even among those who scoffed at superstition, there was caution. A Venetian merchant who described himself as rational and unshaken still noted that he preferred to sleep in the stables than under the painted heavens of Count Tomas, whose ceiling featured winged figures with mirrors for eyes. These mirrors, it turns out, were polished discs of tin, subtly embedded in the plaster to reflect the light of the room, an optical trick that turned candle flicker into darting glances. If a guest caught their own distorted reflection mid-sin, so much the better. Beyond noble homes, some monasteries also adopted the technique, though often with more symbolic intent. In certain ascetic communities, novices slept in dormitories whose ceilings were covered in murals of judgment, damnation, and divine forgiveness. It was not meant to shame, but to humble. To remind the brother that even in the darkness, one was never alone. The ceiling became a kind of moral sky, unmoving, unsleeping. Interestingly, similar ideas appear far beyond Europe. In some Persian palaces, star-shaped skylights were placed above sleeping chambers not just for ventilation but to remind the occupant that the heavens look down. In Chinese tradition, painted dragons on the ceiling of temples were said to protect the pure and unnerve the deceitful. Though separated by language and faith, the human impulse to be watched by something higher, whether divine, symbolic, or imagined, seems remarkably consistent. Back in Western Europe, the age of such ceilings waned with the Reformation and the rise of architectural minimalism. The ornate, allegorical ceilings were seen as decadent, superstitious, even idolatrous. Many were plastered over or quietly painted white. Yet in some quiet corners, chapels left untouched, castles preserved by disinterest, the painted eyes remain. Not blinking, not judging, just watching. So the next time you lie beneath a high-beamed ceiling, consider what stories might be resting just above your head. Not to frighten you, but to remind you that long before security cameras and polygraphs, guilt had a much older adversary, the silent, staring saint painted in the shadows. Because in a world without electricity, where truth was slippery and conscience heavy, even a bit of pigment in a ceiling corner could carry the weight of revelation. And though most of these ceilings no longer whisper secrets at midnight, perhaps, if you listen carefully and let your thoughts wander slowly, you can still imagine what it felt like, centuries ago, to be alone in a room with the walls watching. The stone niches that could swallow a candle's flame. Imagine yourself inside a medieval church. The doors have closed behind you, and the air is still, cool, quiet, and thick with the scent of old incense and damp stone. The flicker of torchlight is soft here, almost shy. High above, wooden beams vanish into darkness. All around you, the hush of history presses gently in. And then, near the wall, you notice something peculiar. A small, shallow niche carved into the stone, just large enough to hold a single candle. It is unmarked, no icon, no carving, no saint's name, just a smooth, time-worn recess. And yet, people approach it with care. They light a taper, place it softly within, and then the flame vanishes. Not blown out, not melted, simply gone. A breathless flicker, and then nothing. Some try again. It happens once more. The candle refuses to stay lit. Others watch in silence. And someone, perhaps a local, offers a quiet explanation. It knows. In medieval folklore, there were stories, shared mostly in whispers, that certain niches in certain sacred walls could judge the truth in a person's heart. If the one lighting the candle was dishonest, impure, or had unconfessed sin, the flame would not burn. The stone itself would seem to swallow the light. Of course, such ideas were never official doctrine. But they spread. Pilgrims heard them along muddy roads and in the corners of taverns. Traveling scribes occasionally noted them in the margins of their journals. Here, the wall tests the soul, one wrote in the 14th century, beside an unnamed abbey near Dijon. But why did people believe? To understand that, we must enter the rhythm of medieval belief, not as superstition, but as a lens through which reality was interpreted. In a world ruled by invisible forces, grace, sin, divine justice, the material and the spiritual were never far apart. A candle was never just wax and wick. Fire itself was sacred. It represented purification, the Holy Spirit, the presence of God. And in the soft glow of candlelight, the boundary between heaven and earth could seem thinner. A flame that would not stay lit, especially in a niche carved into the wall of a holy building, was not seen as a flaw of draft or wax. It was a sign, a verdict. These niches weren't always grand or decorative. Many were small, easy to miss. You might walk past them without a second glance. Some were embedded near side altars, others near cloisters or deep within crypts. And some, it seems, were made specifically for this ritual. A single candle, a moment of silent testing. In some villages, it became custom to light a taper in such a niche before taking an oath, or before making a deal of significance. A marriage, a land grant, a confession. If the flame stood steady, it was taken as a sign of purity. If it vanished, even once, questions lingered. Now, it's easy to speculate. Drafts in the stonework, humidity in the chamber, impurities in the tallow. And likely, all of these played their part. But that wasn't how it felt to the people of the time. To them, the very idea that the building could participate in truth-telling was not so strange. Churches were alive, in a sense. Consecrated stone. Holy places. Walls that echoed with sermons, with sorrow, with sacred music. Why should they not know? One Benedictine monk, writing in the early 1300s, described how visitors to his abbey in Lorraine would sometimes pause at a wall niche and test their rightness before God. He did not mock it, nor did he fully endorse it. He simply recorded it as part of the life of the church, a quiet ritual among many. And some accounts go further. A 15th century pilgrim's journal from the Rhineland speaks of a woman who lit a candle for her departed husband. It would not stay lit even after several tries. She wept in silence. Days later, she confessed that he had died with debts unpaid and quarrels unresolved. The candle, she said, had revealed it. Only after she made amends on his behalf did the taper finally glow, still and strong. Were such stories embroidered in the retelling? Almost certainly. But they reflect a mindset where flame and truth were intertwined, and where stone, though silent, was never entirely passive. Some masons may have encouraged the stories. Cathedral builders were not only craftsmen, they were storytellers in stone. Hidden carvings, symbolic proportions, deliberate acoustics. It is not unthinkable that certain niches were shaped to influence air currents, making a flame's behavior less predictable. Whether by intent or coincidence, the result was the same: awe, reflection, sometimes fear. In modern times, we light candles casually, for decoration, for scent. But in the medieval world, to light the candle, especially in a sacred place, was a serious gesture. It was a plea, the prayer, a small offering of light in a world often shrouded in darkness. And so when that light vanished, it meant something. Even now, in some older churches in France and Spain, you might find these niches. Empty. Forgotten. The stories no longer told. But if you were to strike a match and place a flame within, and if it flickered once and then died, would you pause? Would you wonder? Maybe it's nothing. A shift in air, a flaw in the wax. Or maybe the stone still remembers how to judge and how to listen. Because in the quietest parts of medieval faith, there was always the belief that something was watching. Not with eyes, but with presence. That honesty, once lit, would glow. And that deception, no matter how small, could never truly hold its flame. And so, the stone remains. The niche is empty, waiting, a space for truth, and perhaps a test. One that only the light can answer. The thresholds that would curse a guest for improper entry. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a doorway, not inside, not outside, but suspended in that quiet space between. The stone beneath your feet is cool. The air within is warmer, tinged with firewood and something herbal, rosemary perhaps, or sweet bay leaves drying above the hearth. But you do not move forward, because to cross this threshold uninvited, unblessed, unspoken for, might curse you for life. It is not an open superstition shouted aloud. It is quieter than that. In certain households across medieval Europe, especially among the nobility and landed elite, the threshold of a great hall or private chamber was not simply a boundary of wood and stone. It was a sacred border, a place between realms. To enter it improperly was to trespass not only against the body of the Lord, but against unseen forces that guarded the home. There are records, some whispered in travel diaries, others preserved in regional chronicles, that described guests frozen at the doorway, feet hovering just short of the lintel. One even records a visiting scribe who paused at the hall's mouth, pale, until the steward murmured the words and made the sign over his shoulder. The words are never written down. They were spoken too softly, or perhaps deliberately kept secret, but the ritual existed. This was not a superstition shared by all. It was highly localized, appearing most often in border regions, isolated manors, and among families who claimed descent from older bloodlines or who had built their estates near ancient ruins. Some scholars trace the practice to older pre-Christian rites, folded carefully into Christian language over time. Others suggest it was a form of household control, a way to reinforce hierarchy and mystery within elite homes. But the belief was clear. The threshold had power. To understand why, we must remember how space was imagined in the medieval world. Rooms weren't just architectural. They were symbolic. The hearth was the heart, the solar the soul, the chapel the conscience, and the threshold, this line between inner and outer, was the skin, the veil, a vulnerable point where the known and unknown met. Doors were not always closed, but they were always watched. Many noble households employed rituals of entry that went beyond simple greeting. In some regions of France, it was customary for arriving guests to pause at the door and offer a slight bow, not to the Lord, who had not yet appeared, but to the space itself. In certain parts of Wales, a basin of water was placed just inside the door, not for cleanliness, but as a sign that the guest had passed under spiritual protection. Elsewhere, evergreen branches were placed above thresholds, not only for festivity, but for warding. But in some homes, this quiet rite was more specific. Visitors were not permitted to step inside until someone, often a servant or younger member of the household, performed a small gesture or whispered phrase. This might involve placing a hand on the guest's shoulder or sprinkling a drop of water on the stones just ahead of their feet. Occasionally, they would trace a small circle with a sprig of dried herb, mugwort, or sage directly over the threshold line. These rituals were not done with pomp or formality. In fact, the more private they were, the more seriously they were taken. There are references in letters to guests feeling unsettled or struck with ill favor when made to cross without them. One minor lord in what is now southern Germany is said to have forbidden entry to any traveler unless the rite was done in full, claiming he had once seen a man's shadow fracture when he stepped in too soon. What does that mean? No one knows. but it was recorded without irony. The threshold, it seems, was a kind of test, a mirror, a judgment. Even in the design of homes, we see this belief reflected. Threshold stones were often distinct, darker, smoother, or carved with subtle symbols. Some bore weathered markings mistaken for decoration, but which may have had meaning: spirals, tiny crosses, or knots believed to bind the flow of harmful spirits. In a few preserved structures, you'll find small holes just inside the doorway, cup-like indentations where water or salt was placed, to be stepped over. Sometimes a dog was made to enter first. This wasn't cruelty. In fact, it was thought to be protection. Dogs were believed to be sensitive to spirits, and their crossing could either appease or activate the forces waiting beyond the door. In some areas, a cat served the same role. There is a Danish account of a visitor refusing to enter a winter hall until the house cat passed inside ahead of him, and when the cat hesitated, he waited nearly an hour at the door. This too is history. Not official history. Not the kind written in royal records or sealed in wax. But lived history. The rituals people followed without questioning, because the cost of breaking them was whispered to be high. What happened if you crossed improperly? The records are vague but suggestive. Illness, recurring misfortune, the death of livestock. Strange dreams. A sudden falling out between allies. In a few cases, the guests themselves fell into disgrace soon after, though whether this was blamed on the curse, or whether their misstep had marked them as careless in the eyes of the host, is never quite clear. The line between belief and consequence is often thin. But what is most compelling about these threshold tales is how deeply they reveal the mindset of the time. The medieval world was saturated with boundary thinking. Between life and death. Between heaven and earth. Between one class and another. The door was not just wood. It was the marker between chaos and order, danger and safety, outsider and kin. And stepping over it meant something. Today, we step over thresholds without thinking. A door is just a barrier against weather or noise. But in those centuries, it was an act. A transition. One that, in some places, still echoes faintly in the way we pause before entering a sacred space, or knock even when the door is already open. So if you ever find yourself in an old hall, where the air changes at the entrance and the stone beneath your foot seems unusually smooth, perhaps wait. Let someone else step first. Or whisper a few words of your own, just in case. The hollow columns that gathered bad intentions like dust. Imagine entering a grand hall near sunset. The light drifts in through stained glass windows, casting long amber shapes across the tiled floor. The stone is cool beneath your feet. The air is still, quiet, except for the faint echo of your steps. And surrounding you are the pillars. Tall, heavy, unmoving. They rise from floor to ceiling like silent witnesses, holding the space as if in breathless anticipation. You pause near one. It seems solid, imposing. But if you place your hand gently against the stone and listen closely, you might feel something else. Not sound exactly. Not vibration. Just presence. As though the column holds more than its weight. As though something waits inside it, gathering slowly, invisibly. In the medieval and early modern world, grand halls were carefully designed not only for structure but for sound. The geometry of ceilings, the curve of arches, the placement of walls, all mattered. Among these choices was a lesser-known architectural trick: hollow columns. Built with empty chambers inside, these voids allowed sound to carry more clearly, especially in large echo-prone rooms like courts, cloisters, or cathedrals. To the masons and architects, the purpose was practical. They understood how sound could be dampened or distorted by solid stone. A column with space inside acted like a tuning chamber, subtly shaping the acoustics so voices could travel clearly from one end of the room to the other. It was a quiet sort of brilliance, rarely seen, but often heard. But to the commoners, the clergy, the servants and stewards who lived beneath these vast structures, the explanation wasn't always so clean. There was something unsettling about a column that looked solid but wasn't. Something unnerving about a space intentionally hollowed out and then sealed. A place where no one could see, and yet something could be kept. And so, in whispered conversation and local superstition, another theory took shape. That these hollows didn't just collect sound, they collected intention. Bad thoughts, greedy eyes, quiet resentments, the lingering weight of envy and malice spoken beneath vaulted ceilings. That over time, these feelings gathered inside the columns like dust, accumulating, thickening, pressing outward into the room. In noble courts, it was said that arguments erupted more easily when too many people stood near certain pillars. In one account from 1483, a steward in a minor German duchy wrote that tempers flared most often near the third column of the audience hall. As though the stone itself breathes discontent, he noted, or remembers what should have been forgotten. Of course, there was no formal investigation. These were not matters for architects or kings. But the servants moved the tables away from that column, quietly, without instruction, and the court dined more peacefully after. In some cloisters and chapels, similar beliefs emerged, that prayers spoken near certain pillars were less comforting, that the air felt heavier there, not cursed exactly, just laden, as though the stone was listening and not kindly, a place where words sank instead of rising, a hush not of reverence but of something else. This quiet dread extended into folklore. In some towns, people claimed that the columns could absorb intentions, especially ill ones, and release them when gatherings were most vulnerable. A marriage celebration might sour. A council might divide. It wasn't a spell. It wasn't punishment. Just stored energy. Human bitterness, contained and forgotten, returning in the form of silence that chilled the room. And yet, the architectural purpose remained unchanged. Hollow columns continued to appear in palaces, manors, even universities. Always for acoustics. Always discreet. And always with the unintended side effect of making the space feel somehow more alert. More listening than inert stone should be. Some scholars have tried to explain this perception through psychology. That we associate echo and hollowness with vacancy, and vacancy with threat. That our minds, even subconsciously, are uneasy in the presence of spaces that are both sealed and unseen. That the knowledge something could be inside, though we'll never know what, triggers an ancient discomfort. Still, it's worth noting that in cultures across the world, empty chambers are treated with caution. In tombs, in towers, in sacred grounds. A hollow space that cannot be used becomes, over time, something closer to a vessel. A place where meaning accumulates, whether intentionally or not. And perhaps that's the simplest way to understand these columns. Not as evil, not even as supernatural, but as containers. Silent, neutral, indifferent. They gather what we bring. And in places where politics, ambition, ceremony, and envy all mix, perhaps the columns are not the source of poison, but the mirror that reflects it. So tonight, if your mind drifts to high halls and cold stone, to echoing footsteps beneath ancient ceilings, picture the columns. Still, empty within, holding the weight of both structure and memory. Not alive, but not entirely asleep either. Just waiting, gathering, as they always have. The walls that wept when betrayal was near. Imagine waking to silence in a stone castle, the fire long extinguished, and only the faintest flicker of pale dawn seeping through the arrow-slit windows. The air is cool and close. You walk slowly through the hallway toward the council chamber. Along the eastern wall, just beneath a faded tapestry of hunting stags, you pause. You run your fingers across the masonry. And there it is again. The stones are damp. Not wet exactly, not dripping, but unmistakably slick, as if they had exhaled moisture in the night. In a place with no running water and no rain in days, it feels out of place. In many castles, across centuries of European history, servants and guards were said to check certain walls first thing each morning, not for cracks or wear, but for something more subtle. A sheen, a sweat, a warning. Because according to some, the castle itself could sense treachery. And when betrayal was near, the walls wept. This belief wasn't necessarily formalized in doctrine. It was rarely spoken aloud in front of lords or bishops. But in private corners of castle life, among stewards, chamberlains, and long-serving staff, the idea held quiet power. Certain stones were watched. Their dampness became a sign. and the ones who knew where to check did so before anyone else stirred. Stone, of course, does gather condensation, especially in cold, drafty buildings, where firelight flickers against freezing masonry. But in the medieval mind, natural causes were rarely enough. The physical world was imbued with meaning, moral, spiritual, symbolic. A sword that snapped was not merely flawed, it might signify divine displeasure. A falcon that refused to fly could indicate bad luck. And walls that moistened without cause suggested conscience. Chronicles from England, the Holy Roman Empire, and parts of Italy describe odd rituals around such weeping stones. In one 14th century northern French estate record, a steward notes in plain Latin, "Pariis iterum humidus in aurora, silentium servatum e." The wall was again damp at dawn, silence was kept. It's unclear whether this meant someone was disciplined or whether gossip was simply suppressed. Either way, the incident was logged. These weepings were often localized. A particular stone, or cluster of stones, would be watched. Over time, these stones gained names. The Betrayer's Row, the Cold Arch, the Widow's Teeth. Some received superstitious touches, blessed salt hidden in the cracks, or dried herbs laid at the base. Not overt magic, just preventive measures. Little assurances that someone was still watching. And who was thought to cause the betrayal? Not always enemies. It was insiders, courtiers with shifting loyalties, a cousin with a claim, a knight who had been passed over. The danger of betrayal in a castle came not from those outside its walls, but those who ate at the same table. A lord might trust his guards with his life, and yet order the hearthkeeper's apprentice to monitor the eastern wall. In larger castles, where rooms were sometimes walled off, rebuilt, or expanded across generations, stories grew around particular masonry sections. In one tale from Bohemia, a series of stone blocks near the main tower were said to weep every spring without fail. The household believed it meant a treasonous ancestor had once plotted there, and the stones remembered the guilt. They were not haunted, exactly, just unable to forget. These tales weren't confined to the elite. In smaller keeps and fortified manor houses, even servants developed a quiet intuition. If the walls were damp, voices dropped. Schedules shifted. An inspection might be postponed. A trip to the village delayed. No one said the word betrayal, but everyone moved more cautiously. Castles were not just buildings. They were lived-in structures, repositories of memory, worn down by time and story. Some scholars now interpret these tales as a kind of architectural personification, an attempt to make sense of the unpredictable world of courtly politics. In a realm where truth was slippery, where smiles could mask schemes, it may have been oddly comforting to imagine that the stones themselves held moral clarity, that they could warn of danger even when no lips moved. Moisture also had religious symbolism. Tears were often viewed as holy expressions of repentance. So when walls wept, it wasn't always a sign of doom. It might also suggest guilt was present, that someone had not confessed, that sin lingered. In this way, the architecture itself took on the role of quiet priest. You might picture a candlelit hallway lined with shields and old spears. A servant, barefoot before the fire is lit, presses their palm against a certain block. They frown but say nothing. They light the fire, begin their duties, and watch carefully throughout the day, not the stone, but the people. Who speaks too confidently? Who avoids the eye? Who leaves the chamber too quickly after the Lord's speech? Some of the stories are oddly precise. In a Scottish account from the early 1500s, during a particularly turbulent clan dispute, a wall in a minor castle reportedly wept 3 nights before the steward was found to have poisoned the wine. The chronicler makes no claim of magic, but notes the sequence as if it should be self-explanatory. We cannot know how many of these weepings were natural, caused by weather or poorly cured mortar, and how many were imagined. But in truth, the belief mattered more than the fact. A damp stone-shaped behavior created caution, made people pay attention to the quiet details that might otherwise be ignored. In time, as castles declined in military importance and gave way to more modern residences, such traditions faded. Plaster replaced stone. superstition gave way to engineering. But in the oldest structures still standing, some stones remain discolored, just faintly. Perhaps from centuries of condensation. Or perhaps from memories too dense to dry out. So if you ever visit an old keep on a quiet morning and feel the urge to press your fingers to the wall, do it gently. And if the stone is wet, don't panic. But maybe watch what you say. The bells that rang to warn of impure thoughts. Imagine stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a stone chapel just as the light outside begins to dim. The air inside is still, cool, and scented with wax and ancient dust. A few beeswax candles flicker near the altar, their light catching on the brass rim of a large bell suspended from the wooden rafters. You pause, feeling the weight of silence. And then, without warning, the bell tolls once. Solemn. No hand pulls the rope. No wind stirs the cord. Just one low note, lingering in the stillness. You are not alone. And something, it seems, has noticed your thoughts. Across medieval Europe, accounts emerge, quietly, inconsistently, of bells that tolled not to mark the hour or call to mass, but to reveal a presence. Not physical, but spiritual. These were often small bells suspended above confessionals, or larger ones in rural churches rarely visited by crowds. According to some chroniclers, they rang only when someone with a troubled conscience crossed the threshold. Not simply sinners, but those actively wrestling with guilt. The word used in some texts is conturbatus, meaning disturbed within, unsettled of soul. In the early 13th century, a Benedictine monk named Father Hallward recorded such an occurrence in his diary. He described a traveler entering the abbey church just before Vespers. As the man crossed the nave, the south tower bell gave a single peal. The monks froze. They believed the bell responded only to moral disturbance. The traveler, unaware, simply genuflected and continued. After the service, he asked to confess. What followed, Hallward wrote, was a long and bitter telling, as if the bell had drawn it out of him. Now, of course, there were no mechanical sensors. No magic threads or clever automata in most of these places. Yet the stories endured. Some claimed that the bells were consecrated with a rare blessing, designed not just to ring for the faithful, but to reveal the hidden stains of the soul. Whether that blessing had any actual effect didn't matter. What mattered was the belief. A few churches, especially in parts of northern Germany and Bohemia, hung what they called the bell of burden. These were smaller, thinner bells with a sharp, high sound, said to toll on their own when someone approached with what the records sometimes call troubled intent. Theologians of the period interpreted this phrase not as criminal action, but as interior unrest, impure thoughts, deceitful hearts, or hidden shame. One theory, more psychological than supernatural, is that these bells may have been hung with delicate weights, easily shifted by airflow, uneven floorboards, or even the movement of a heavy cloak brushing past a low rope. In other words, a mere accident. But in a world ruled by symbols, accidents were rarely seen as random. When something rang at just the wrong, or right, moment, it was taken not as coincidence, but as revelation. Imagine, now, a lonely traveler seeking shelter from the rain. He enters a small rural church. It is empty. He steps forward, wet boots echoing on the flagstone. The bell above the sanctuary swings slightly and sings a single note. What can he do but stop, stare, and wonder what has just been seen? We find an echo of this belief in the stories told by pilgrims journeying to Santiago, Canterbury, or Cologne. Some chapels along the way were known not for miracles or relics, but for their watching bells. A pilgrim might approach, and if the bell remained silent, they'd pass in peace. But if it rang even softly, it was said to mean the soul carried a weight too long ignored. The wise knelt and prayed. The proud hurried on, heads lowered. In one particularly detailed account from 1411, a merchant from Rouen wrote of a small chapel in the Pyrenees. It was rarely visited, but known among travelers for one eerie detail. No priest resided there, and yet its bell would ring for sin alone. He noted that he passed through twice with no sound. But on the third visit, harboring a recent treachery, the bell tolled faintly as he crossed the threshold. He spent the night there, kneeling. The next morning, he returned the stolen silver to its owner. Were these tales exaggerated? Likely. But they tell us much about how the medieval mind understood conscience, not as an internal feeling, but as a force visible to the world, even to inanimate things. For them, guilt had weight. Thought could ripple through stone. Morality wasn't private. It shimmered just beneath the surface, waiting for something, like a bell, to announce it. Interestingly, this idea was not restricted to Christianity. In Tibetan temples, wind chimes were sometimes believed to tremble in the presence of a troubled soul. In some Islamic traditions, a particular call to prayer was believed to pierce the heart of the unrepentant. In both East and West, the sound of metal, uninvited, clear, ringing, was treated as a message. And so, in the churches of Old Europe, the bell became something more than a tool of time. It became, for a few, a sentinel of the unseen. As centuries passed, many of these bells were taken down or replaced. Their stories, once whispered from monk to monk, faded into the background. But occasionally, a traveler's diary or forgotten parish record offers a glimpse into that curious fear, that your very thoughts, unspoken and unseen, might echo out into the silence and return as sound. And now, as you lie still and imagine the stone arches and dim candlelight of those ancient churches, you might hear it too, the faint memory of a bell, tolling not for time, but for truth. Only once. Then silence. Just enough to make you wonder what part of you it noticed. The dining halls where echoes were spirits repeating gossip. Imagine yourself seated at a long, carved table in the great hall of a medieval fortress. The firelight is low. Candles flicker along the walls. Heavy stone arches loom overhead. Servants move silently, carefully. Distant footsteps vanish into vaulted ceilings. And in this deep hush, between clatter of cup and murmur of voice, you begin to notice something else. Your own words, returning to you, but not all at once. Not quite as they were spoken. A moment after you speak, your phrase seems to come back, warped slightly, distant but familiar, as though someone, somewhere, is softly repeating what you've just said. And not for the first time, a nobleman glances over his shoulder. A guest leans in and lowers his voice. A wary eye turns to the corners of the hall, half expecting to see someone, or something, listening. In many medieval castles and monasteries, particularly those constructed with large vaulted halls, there emerged a curious and unsettling phenomenon. The echo that sounded not like sound, but like mimicry. A delay. A voice turned back upon itself. Today we know this as a quirk of acoustics. Long corridors, arched ceilings, curved walls that carry and rebound sound waves. But to those living in the 12th or 13th centuries, especially in isolated, echoing estates, the explanation was less certain, and often far more imaginative. Some believed that the walls were inhabited, that spirits, or remnants of them, dwelt within the stone. Not malicious, not helpful, simply present, observing, repeating. In many chronicles, especially those of Northern Europe, there are brief but consistent mentions of what we might call echo phantoms. Spirits that did not appear, but spoke. Not in their own words, but in yours. Repeating them just as you said them, a heartbeat later. Sometimes louder, sometimes whispered. It was said that these spirits were most active during mealtimes. Great dining halls, such as those in Westminster, Mont Saint-Michel, or the fortified manor houses of the Rhineland, were perfect chambers for sound to misbehave. Their ribbed vaults and parallel stone walls reflected speech in curious ways. A joke at one end could carry clearly to the other, yet vanish if spoken just a step to the left. Whispers beneath banners were sometimes heard more clearly than shouts beside the hearth. In such places, guests became careful, especially when the company was high-ranking lords, bishops, foreign dignitaries. Words, once spoken, did not seem to stay put. Conversations acquired an unintended audience. One 14th century steward's journal from Burgundy describes a visiting count growing unsettled after hearing his own voice return to him from above, like a child mocking his tone. The steward, aware of the hall's tendency to catch and bend words, made note of the count's request to speak only in alcoves or near hangings, places where the stone would not listen. Tapestries, in fact, served a double purpose. Ornamental, yes, but also acoustic. Many dining halls began hanging heavy cloth along the walls not just to display wealth, but to tame sound. And, perhaps, to silence what some believed were listening ghosts. The fear was not always supernatural. In courtly life, reputation was delicate. Gossip could be as lethal as a sword. And the idea that your private remark might be repeated, even innocently, even by echo, was unnerving. Especially if the voice returning it didn't sound quite like yours. This is where the folklore deepens. Some claimed that the echoing voice was slightly off, different in tone, or older, or sharper. Not merely reflection, but impersonation, like a shadow wearing your voice. Of course, such tales walked the line between metaphor and belief. Monasteries had their own interpretation. In some cloisters, echo chambers were considered tests of humility. If your words returned to you, it meant you were speaking too loudly or too often. A silent rebuke. The walls themselves, it was said, could remind you to be modest. In noble households, however, the mood was different. Here, an echo was often treated with suspicion. Servants might cross themselves if they heard a voice answer from nowhere. And hosts, especially those accustomed to intrigue, took care where they spoke. Even architecture responded. Some later halls, built in the 15th century, incorporated deliberate asymmetry. Angled corners, wooden beams, arched vaults softened with timber ribs or hung banners. All to control sound. Not just for comfort, but for discretion. But the belief persisted, even after its origins were forgotten. Some said the stone remembered secrets. Others said that every word spoken in anger or deceit lingered in the air longer than it should, given shape and voice by forces unseen. A particularly poetic monk, writing from an abbey in Kent, called these echoes verba revenientes, returning words. He imagined that sins spoken aloud, gossip, slander, false promises, could not vanish. That they lingered in the cracks of old stone, and when the hour was quiet enough, they tried to escape. He advised silence after nightfall. For by then, he wrote, the echoes grow restless. We might smile at such words now. And yet, anyone who has stood alone in an empty cathedral, or spoken softly in a vast, dark hall, knows that strange sensation, your own voice coming back to you in disguise. Not louder, not clearer, just unfamiliar enough to feel like another presence. It is likely that these stories were comfort or caution, a way of saying, your words matter. They go further than you think. They travel. They return. Sometimes in ways you cannot control. And so, in the rhythm of medieval life, where speech was both sacred and dangerous, the echo became more than sound. It was a warning, a reminder, that even in solitude, you were never entirely alone. The walls, it seemed, were always listening, and sometimes they answered back. Not in judgment, not in malice, but with perfect, ghostly repetition, as if they simply couldn't help but remember. The stone faces that listened in absolute silence. Imagine yourself seated in a long wooden chair by the fire. The chamber is quiet except for the soft hiss of a log settling in the hearth and the occasional clink of a goblet against stone. The room is dim, lit by torch and taper, the air thick with the scent of old smoke, wax, and the faint sharpness of aged iron from the fire tools nearby. Now, lift your eyes just slightly, to the carved beam above the hearth, the edge of the eaves, or the arch above the door. There, watching in perfect stillness, is a face. Not a painting, not a person, but a carved stone head, sometimes life-sized, sometimes grotesquely small. Its expression might be blank, or smirking, or gently sorrowful. Its eyes, though made of stone, always seem just slightly too aware. In certain halls, guests believed these faces could hear, and more unsettling still, that they could remember. These were the listening stones, the carved watchers. In England, they were sometimes called eaves watchers, a play on the literal location, tucked beneath the eaves, and the older term eavesdropper. In France, they were referred to as les têtes murmurantes, the whispering heads. In the Germanic regions, some were simply called Erhörer, which loosely translates to ancient hearers. They were not just decoration. At least, not in the eyes of those who feared them. You will find references to them scattered throughout regional folklore, household journals, and even a few legal cases. They appear in manor records from the 14th and 15th centuries, often noted in the margins as having been set above the hearth or renewed at the west beam. They are never explained. They do not need to be. People already knew what they were for. In many noble households, these carvings took on a quiet authority. It wasn't that anyone believed the stone itself could speak, but rather that it could bear witness. That words spoken beneath the gaze of the face would not vanish, but be stored, somehow, tucked inside the silent mouth or recorded behind those unmoving eyes. And one day, whether by fate, divine will, or the slow workings of justice, those words would return. To whom and how was never made clear. But the unease remained. Guests in such halls often sat differently, straighter, more still. There are diary entries from visiting clerics and minor lords who mention the discomfort of dining beneath such carvings. One wrote that the meal passed with little merriment, for no one dared speak too freely under the stone's regard. Another noted that a scandal was narrowly avoided because the ceiling bore witness, and no one wished to risk being the one remembered. The origin of this belief is murky. Stone heads have been part of European architecture for centuries. Gargoyles on cathedrals, grotesques on abbeys, and domestic carvings on beam ends or fireplace lintels. In earlier times, these were often symbolic, warding off evil, representing sins, or simply echoing the human form as a mark of craftsmanship. But something shifted when these figures moved indoors. Placed above hearths, above doorways, or tucked just beneath sleeping chambers, they no longer faced out toward danger, but in toward daily life. They became watchers not of the road or sky, but of the home. And in a world where privacy was rare and reputations fragile, even the illusion of being watched was enough to change behavior. There's also something deeply human about the fear. We are pattern-seeking creatures. The pair of eyes, even carved, triggers a response. We behave differently when observed, even if the observer is made of wood or stone. This phenomenon is well documented in psychology today. But centuries ago, it wasn't a theory. It was a quiet truth. People felt the weight of that gaze. And in many households, it was encouraged. Some lords had faces carved deliberately in strategic places. Over the entryway to the courtroom, at the center beam of the guest hall, above the main table where disputes were settled. It sent a message: speak carefully. You are being witnessed. Perhaps not judged now, but eventually. In some cases, the faces were stylized to look like saints or angels. In others, they were monstrous, distorted to evoke discomfort. A wide grin, an exaggerated ear, a face that seemed too human to be ignored and too unnatural to trust. One preserved hall in Yorkshire contains 3 such faces spaced evenly along the support beams of the ceiling. Local tradition claims each face represents a virtue: honesty, loyalty, and discretion. A visitor there once noted in the 17th century that he feared to lie beneath them, lest the wood remember his falsehood. Not even stone, but wood, yet the idea remained. The faces remembered. They never recorded in ink or voice. They simply held it, quietly, until the right moment. The belief slowly faded as architecture modernized. Stone gave way to plaster, heavy beams to cleaner lines. And yet, even now, in some old homes and chapels, you can still find them. Worn faces peering down from forgotten corners. Their features softened by time. Their presence no longer acknowledged, but not quite erased. Perhaps the most fascinating thing is this: even without belief, people still behave differently in their presence. Walk into an old hall. See one of these faces peering from above the mantel or door. You might find yourself lowering your voice, softening your tone. You might pause, mid-sentence, unsure why. The watcher does not blink, but your words weigh more heavily in the air. It is not fear. Not really. It is memory, a quiet instinct inherited from centuries past, when walls could hear, and stone did not forget. The doors that closed themselves on unworthy hands. Imagine a long corridor lined with stone, quiet except for the soft echo of your footsteps. The air is cool, touched with the scent of oiled wood and distant hearth smoke. At the far end stands a tall door, thick, ancient, iron-braced. It rests slightly open, as though inviting. But as you reach out, your hand grazing its surface, something changes. The door doesn't welcome. It shudders. Then slowly, firmly, closes. You try again. The hinges creak. The weight shifts. And then it seals shut, soundlessly. Moments later, someone behind you walks forward, presses the same handle, and the door swings open effortlessly. You're left standing in the cold, not blocked by guards or locks, but by something stranger. Something felt. In a few scattered chronicles and household accounts from the 13th to 15th centuries, there are quiet mentions of this phenomenon, doors that refused entry to certain individuals without cause. Not locked. Not jammed. Simply unwilling. These weren't magical tales. Exactly. Not cloaked in spellcraft or sorcery, but treated with a cautious seriousness. A mechanical mystery woven with moral suspicion. One such entry comes from a steward's record in 1381. During a feast at a manor in northern France, a guest of good standing was expected through the West Hall. Servants reported the door had been operating smoothly all week. But when the guest arrived, it would not open. The hinges strained but held firm. The man, embarrassed, had to be shown through the rear passage, an unspoken insult. The next day, the same door opened without resistance for dozens of others. Was it a coincidence? A quirk of warped wood and iron in cold weather? Perhaps. But to those present, it meant something more. It was noted, quietly, that the guest in question had once been accused of breaking a sworn vow. Nothing proven. Nothing spoken aloud. But the door, it seemed, remembered. In other accounts, the doors in question were linked to sacred or ceremonial spaces, chapel entrances, council chambers, archives. Places where intent mattered as much as presence. If someone approached with a lie or a false purpose, the belief was that the very materials of the place would resist. The door would grow heavier in their hands. Or simply shut entirely. This belief wasn't isolated to one region. In several Benedictine monasteries, older monks trained apprentices to observe the doors during certain rituals. Not to police, but to notice. If a novice reached for the chapter house door and it responded strangely, as one monk phrased it, it was seen not as a punishment, but as a signal. That the spirit was unready. That the truth they carried wasn't aligned with the space they sought to enter. Of course, there are natural explanations. Old doors, especially those made of seasoned oak or yew, were sensitive to weather, moisture, and warping. Iron hinges expanded and contracted with heat. A door that opened with ease on one morning might resist in the evening. But the perception of the door as conscious, as aware, was a cultural constant. In an era when so much meaning was drawn from signs and symbols, it was entirely natural to see moral reflection in physical resistance. When a door denied someone, it wasn't mechanical, it was moral. A judgment not by man, but by place. The household. The building itself. In noble courts, this became a quiet form of political theater. If someone of questionable allegiance was denied entry by an uncooperative door, the incident would be mentioned subtly, never publicly mocked, but quietly remembered. And for the guest, the shame of being singled out by an inanimate threshold could linger far longer than a spoken accusation. Even architects of the time seemed aware of this phenomenon, though their explanations were more structural. Manuals on manor construction advised reinforcing ceremonial doors in ways that made them less predictable to use, adding complex hinges or slight counterweights. Some scholars suggest this may have been intentional, not just for security, but to give the door its own temperament, a gatekeeper that needed no words. In folklore, this idea persisted far beyond the medieval period. In rural communities, some claimed that doors could feel lies, that a home would recognize falsehood by sound or scent. That would, having once been alive, retained an instinct for truth, a superstition, perhaps, but one deeply human. The desire to believe that our spaces protect us not just from danger, but from dishonesty. It's worth noting that not all such doors were punitive. Some were said to guide. A resistant door might encourage a hesitant person to rethink their approach. A servant burdened by guilt might stand outside until they gathered the courage to speak honestly. The door, in that sense, wasn't a barrier, it was a pause. A moment of reflection in wood and iron. And so these stories endure, half fact and half feeling. Doors that close themselves not from whim or weather, but from a quiet kind of awareness. A recognition of something misaligned, not in the hand, but in the heart. So tonight, imagine walking through such a space. A quiet corridor, the air thick with history, your footsteps soft on stone. And before you, a tall door. You reach for it, slowly. Not with force, but with stillness. If it opens, it does so gently. If it does not, perhaps it is not you who has failed, but something within that simply needs to settle before entering. Because some doors, it seems, do more than open and close. They listen, and sometimes they choose. The narrow passages that tested a person's honesty. Imagine yourself stepping into a narrow stone corridor deep within a medieval castle. The air is cooler here, more still. The walls close in gently, not oppressively, but just enough to make your shoulders aware of the space. Torchlight flickers along the rough-hewn blocks, casting elongated shadows that don't always move the way you expect. You take another step, and another. Then, without warning, you feel a faint pressure behind the eyes. A lightness. Not pain, but the sensation that something is quietly off. You might pause, adjust your footing, and glance behind you. No one there. The passage narrows further. The walls curve in ways that don't quite match the exterior layout of the keep. And for a fleeting moment, it feels as if the corridor itself is watching. In some medieval noble households, there were places like this, thin walkways between towers or chambers, rarely used in public view, but whispered about in private. Chroniclers tell of corridors said to test a person's honesty. If someone entered with a hidden motive, a lie in their heart, or an unspoken betrayal on their mind, they might experience confusion, vertigo, or even a strange trembling in the limbs. It was believed that the walls themselves reacted, not violently, but subtly, enough to make the truth stir beneath the skin. These stories weren't architectural folklore in the usual sense. They weren't ghost tales told around fires. Instead, they lived quietly in the margins, mentioned in household records, letters, and occasional court chronicles. A foreign envoy becomes faint while approaching the Great Hall. A disinherited cousin loses his balance in a corridor others pass through with ease. Servants whisper afterward, saying it was the passage that revealed him. The idea that architecture could detect deception wasn't so strange in a world where everything physical was tied to the spiritual. Stones, after all, were thought to hold memory. Wood could warp in response to emotion. Bells could ring of their own accord to signal death. Why shouldn't walls sense intent? Some corridors gained reputations over time. In a small castle in the Pyrenees, a winding hallway between the chapel and the Lord's chamber was known as La Gorge Étroite, the narrow throat. Guests were sometimes led through it as a kind of informal trial. If they stumbled, hesitated, or emerged pale, it would be quietly noted. In another case, from an English estate near the Welsh border, a corridor was built to curve subtly, not for aesthetics, but for clarity. A 15th century steward's record states plainly, those with hidden quarrels struggle to walk the curve unbroken. It's possible some of this was psychological. Narrow spaces already heighten tension. Medieval corridors could be uneven, dimly lit, and disorienting, especially for guests unfamiliar with the layout. A noble entering such a space, already burdened with guilt or fear, might experience exactly the symptoms the rumors predicted. Their pulse would rise. Their balance would shift. And because they had heard the stories, even if they didn't believe them, their body might betray them. But belief is often more powerful than fact. In the world of medieval politics, subtle rituals mattered. A glance held too long. A silence after a toast. A misstep in a passage. These things shaped decisions. A corridor that could test honesty was a useful tool. It needed no guard, no blade. It simply needed to be believed. Some castles reportedly altered these passageways over time, not to trap intruders, but to sharpen their psychological edge. Ceilings might slope just slightly. The floor might rise in a way that appeared flat. Torch brackets were placed unevenly, creating shifting shadows. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would stand out to an honest visitor. But someone with a racing heart, eyes darting, mind rehearsing excuses, they might falter. Noble families used this in quiet ways. A daughter's suitor might be led down the corridor before being welcomed into the hall. A vassal suspected of plotting could be asked to retrieve something from the far chamber. No escort, just a walk. If they returned flustered or took longer than expected, it might raise a silent flag. There's even record of confessions made afterward, not because of interrogation, but because the corridor had unsettled the speaker. In a Bavarian monastery that shared some architectural features with local castles, a novice wrote that he admitted a long-held deceit to his superior because the walls pressed on my guilt. No one had questioned him. The corridor, he believed, had done the work. Of course, none of this was official. There were no laws about these corridors. No declarations. But within castle life, where power danced in shadows and every gesture could be read as strategy, even a building's silence could be part of the performance. Over time, some of these corridors were sealed. Not out of fear, but practicality. As castles expanded, spaces were repurposed. The rooms they connected were no longer in use. Others remain quiet, unsignposted. Visitors today might walk through them with no sensation at all. Just stone and quiet. But once in a while, someone stops, looks around, wonders why the corridor curves where it shouldn't, wonders why they feel so warm, or why their breath quickens just slightly. There's no magic, no trick, just memory, and the faint, lingering idea that stones, especially old ones, might still prefer the truth. The corner niches that collected the sins of generations. Imagine wandering through the shadowed halls of a centuries-old castle. The air grows quieter the deeper you go, the torchlight fainter, flickering against walls of uneven stone. Here and there, between faded tapestries and crumbling mortar lines, are small niches, carved recesses in the wall, no larger than a lantern. They are empty, always empty, but you find yourself pausing near one. A faint draft touches your skin, though there's no window. You feel suddenly watched or perhaps remembered. The chill isn't from the air, but something older, something left behind. These small architectural features, corner niches, wall alcoves, or shadowed recesses, are found throughout medieval structures. Many served practical purposes, holding candles, reliquaries, or devotional statues. But not all. Some were curiously bare, never used, never decorated, and over time, they gathered more than dust. In the oral histories passed down by chambermaids, scribes, and groundskeepers, a strange belief took root that these empty spaces were more than architectural leftovers. They were vessels, places where unspoken regrets, lies, and betrayals gathered silently. Not just from one generation, but from all who had passed through. Sins too quiet to confess, shames too subtle to name. In a castle near the Danube, a 16th century steward kept a log of unusual complaints from noble guests. One entry reads, "Lady Anika passed the northeast hall and fell to a chill so bitter she clutched her chest. No fire warmed her afterward." That corner, the steward notes, housed a niche, never filled, though stone enough was available. Other guests reported avoiding that hallway entirely, saying it felt as if the stone itself disapproved of them. Whether belief or superstition, the idea persisted. A niche left deliberately unfilled was a warning, a place for the intangible, the unresolved. Architects of the time rarely documented such intentions. Medieval blueprints were often informal, but masons and apprentices carried oral traditions. Some whispered that a castle without a listening hollow would suffer misfortune. That unconfessed sins, if left without a resting place, would find other outlets, perhaps in illness, bad harvests, or unrest among servants. In some traditions, especially in remote French and Moravian estates, it was customary for the head of household to pause at these niches before dinner gatherings, touching the edge briefly, a kind of silent offering. Not a prayer exactly, more like an acknowledgement, a recognition that some parts of the past lingered, even as new meals were served and new stories spun. This idea, that places absorb emotion, is not uniquely medieval. Across cultures, sacred and profane spaces alike are often believed to retain memory. In Japanese Shinto, for instance, spirits may inhabit quiet corners of old houses. In Celtic ruins, travelers reported standing stones that remembered sorrow. And in the dim corners of European castles, it was said that stone was not passive. It listened, and over time, it filled. Interestingly, many of these niches appear in locations with little practical utility. High up stairwells, behind tapestries, just beside guest chambers. Some were tucked away near servant passages, where few eyes fell. And yet, accounts describe people, especially those unfamiliar with the building, feeling discomfort when passing near them. A tightening in the chest, a sudden need to quicken the step. One 1483 letter from a visiting cleric in Burgundy described a niche, so deep and cold it stung the skin with no breeze. He believed it held the weight of 1,000 silences. These weren't haunted spaces in the modern sense. There are no stories of screams or apparitions. The fear was quieter, subtler, more like reverence. You did not run from the niches. You simply avoided them, or nodded as you passed, as if acknowledging an elder who had seen too much. In a few cases, later owners attempted to fill these niches, perhaps to modernize or dispel old fears. Yet the additions rarely stayed. A vase knocked over. A candle never stayed lit. Eventually, the niche would be emptied again, restored by neglect or quiet discomfort. Some historians argue that this belief in sin-storing niches was less theological and more psychological. In a time when public confession was common but private guilt rarely addressed, people projected their unspoken emotions into architecture. A niche became a mirror, not of the self, but of what the self wished to forget. If you couldn't say it aloud, you could at least leave it somewhere. And the niche would hold it, without judgment, for as long as the stone stood. There's a certain comfort in that idea, that even the heaviest memories don't vanish, but rest somewhere, safely tucked into walls that no longer speak, but still remember. Today, when visiting old castles, most walk past these corners without a glance. But occasionally, someone will pause, frown slightly, feel the air shift, and not know why. Perhaps it is the chill, perhaps it is the history, or perhaps something lingers still, a weightless inheritance of emotion waiting quietly in the stone. And so, as you drift now through these mental hallways, allow yourself to imagine those niches not as ominous, but as gentle keepers. They do not judge. They do not echo. They simply hold what we could not carry. And in their silence, they remind us, some parts of the past do not need to be named to be remembered. The altars that changed color at a false vow. Imagine yourself in a chapel centuries ago. The air is cool and still, touched by the faint scent of beeswax and damp stone. Candles flicker softly in iron sconces. High above, light from a narrow window casts thin beams across the floor, pooling near a low stone altar at the front of the room. It is unadorned, no gold, no carved figures, just a block of limestone, weathered smooth by time and ritual. A figure steps forward. He kneels. He places one hand on the altar, and he swears an oath. It might be a vow of loyalty to a lord, a marriage promise, a declaration of peace. The words are solemn, slow, deliberate. But behind the stillness, some among the witnesses do not watch the speaker. They watch the stone, waiting to see if it darkens. There were places in the medieval world where people believed that certain altars, especially in small chapels or remote monasteries, had a way of knowing that if someone stood before them and spoke falsely, the altar would respond. Not loudly, not with fire or tremor, but simply by changing color. It would darken, they said, as though shadow had passed across it. A subtle shift in the tone of the stone, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And many were. Accounts of this phenomenon appear not in sermons, but in margins, in small chronicles, in the travel notes of monks and the observations of stewards. Scattered but consistent, the idea that some stones, when made sacred by long years of prayer and vow, could react to dishonesty. That the very material of the altar had absorbed so much truth, it could recognize a lie. Naturally, this was not considered official doctrine. No church council ever declared it so. But it circulated quietly, especially in the 12th to 14th centuries, when belief in relics, miracles, and divine signs wove seamlessly into daily life. In that context, an altar that responded to oaths was not impossible. It was simply something to be mindful of. And so, in certain chapels, solemn moments were watched closely. The witnesses to an oath, whether monks, nobles, or common folk, would sometimes shift their gaze from the speaker to the stone itself. The practice was discreet. No one spoke of it aloud. But more than one account describes glances exchanged when the altar seemed, just briefly, to grow dimmer, as if stained by a sudden cloud, though the sky outside was clear. To the medieval mind, a vow was not merely a promise. It was a contract with the divine. To break it was to sin. To lie while making it was to challenge heaven itself. And so altars were not neutral furniture. They were thresholds, touchstones between the human and the sacred. In fact, the Latin root of the word altar, al, comes from a term meaning high place, a space elevated not only in height, but in significance. A place where sacrifice, offering, and truth were joined. And over time, the belief emerged that in rare and ancient altars, truth had soaked into the stone. There is one 13th century account from a chapel in southern France, where a land dispute was settled by oath before a weathered stone altar. A monk wrote that when the lesser noble placed his hand on the stone and swore, the altar grew gray like the smoke of damp wood. Later, it was found that his claim had been false. No action was taken against him, but the tale spread. The chapel saw an increase in visitors for several months afterward. Some came to pray, others, perhaps, to test. Why did people believe? In part, because the alternative, that anyone could lie under oath with no consequence, was far more unsettling. And in a world where justice was often uneven, where power could overshadow truth, the idea that the altar itself might intervene offered a strange reassurance. Even if the courts failed, even if no one else knew, the stone would. And it would mark the moment, quietly in color. From a practical perspective, of course, there are plausible explanations. Limestone, for example, can react to temperature, moisture, and even oils from human skin. The light from a flickering candle could shift perception. A vow spoken with tension might increase sweating, affecting the sheen of the stone. But to the medieval eye, none of this diluted the meaning. The when mattered more than the why. The moment of truth, observed by all, was the only evidence needed. Some altars became known for their responsiveness. Not by name, but by reputation. Monks might quietly advise travelers, if you must swear, do so before the chapel at St. Cyr. It is discerning. No elaboration was needed, and over time, these stories solidified into subtle custom. Not ritualized, not enforced, but remembered. A nobleman might shift his position, placing his palm just so. A bishop might pause a moment longer than usual, waiting to see if the stone would shift before proceeding. A widow sealing a marriage contract might glance quickly at the base of the altar, as if searching for some trace of darkness. But the altar gave no commentary, no sound, no warning, only, perhaps, a faint dimming, and the knowledge, true or not, that it could. The idea faded, eventually. By the 16th century, few wrote of altars reacting to vows. The Reformation shifted how such ideas were received. Churches became plainer. Superstition was more openly discouraged. And stone was stone again. But the chapels remain. Some still hold their old altars, worn smooth by centuries of hands, knees, elbows. You might visit one now, on a quiet afternoon. The light is still there. The silence too. And if you were to rest your hand gently upon the stone and whisper something, anything, it's unlikely the altar would respond. But you might still glance at it, just to see. Because even now, the thought lingers, that truth has weight, that oaths leave a trace, that somewhere in the structure of things, honesty is recorded, not in books or memories, but in matter itself. And if that's true, then perhaps the altar doesn't need to speak. A shift in tone, a deepening of color, that would be enough. A quiet answer from something older than judgment, older than language. Stone that does not forgive, but never forgets. The lanterns that dimmed when treachery was near. Imagine a long, vaulted hallway lined with stone. The walls are cool to the touch, their surface worn smooth by centuries of passing sleeves, quiet hands, and drifting shadows. The air is still, faintly laced with the scent of wax, oil, and old wood. It is evening, or near enough. Outside, the wind combs through the trees. But in here, all is silent. Except for the flame. Lanterns, 7 of them, hang at precise intervals from the ceiling beams. They sway only slightly, chains creaking as if in conversation with one another. Their flames burn low and steady, until one of them, the second from the door, flickers once, then dims. And someone in the hall goes very still. Because in this household, it is said that a fading flame means treachery is near. This belief, though peculiar to the modern ear, was once treated with quiet seriousness by certain noble families. Especially during the later Middle Ages and early Renaissance, when political alliances were fragile and betrayal could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse, some castles were designed or adapted to include what came to be known as the lantern line. These were not ordinary lamps for light alone. They were placed not for utility, but for omen. In several surviving estate inventories and guest journals from the 14th through 16th centuries, we find descriptions of long halls with lanterns suspended at regular intervals, each containing a simple oil flame. The number varied. Some had 5, others 7, a few 9. They were usually placed along the entrance hall or the gallery leading to the great chamber, where decisions were made and allegiances formed. The idea was that when danger neared, specifically betrayal, the flame would warn the household by dimming or stuttering, not extinguishing completely, but faltering, as though the very air grew uneasy. Guests often paused beneath these lanterns before approaching the Lord. Observers watched not just the visitor, but the light above them. If a flame danced strangely, or burned blue, or dimmed for even a moment, some would murmur that a hidden lie had entered the room. But where did this belief begin? There are hints that it may stem from older traditions, where flame was seen not just as light, but as a spiritual gauge, a purifier, and a revealer of truth. In certain monastic texts, for instance, candles left burning in prayer halls were believed to flicker violently in the presence of sin. Elsewhere, flickering light was thought to signal the nearness of a restless spirit or a troubled soul. But in castles and noble households, the flame became political. In a world without surveillance, where words could not be recorded and truth could vanish behind a well-placed smile, anything that gave the illusion of detection gained power. The lanterns became that illusion. Silent, untouchable witnesses whose presence reminded every guest, your intentions are being watched. Even if no one can see your lie, the flame might. The psychological effect cannot be understated. In a letter from 1478, a visiting envoy wrote, "The chamber was still as I entered, save for the lanterns, whose flames bore more scrutiny than I. One dimmed near my shoulder, and I felt all eyes sharpen, though no word was said. That dimming may have been no more than a draught, or the sputter of a poorly trimmed wick. But the belief gave it weight. In an environment where alliances were brittle and suspicion constant, people looked for signs in everything. The flames, it seems, were more than signs. They were stories. In one castle in the lowlands of modern-day Belgium, household records describe a tradition wherein every guest, no matter their rank, was required to walk alone through the lantern-lit hall before being granted audience with the Lord. If the flames held steady, the visit proceeded. If one dimmed, even slightly, the guest was asked to wait in the chapel, sometimes for hours, while a priest performed a quiet blessing, just in case. The flames, of course, didn't truly measure truth, but the hesitation they caused often revealed things the words did not. Some guests stammered. Others grew angry. A few walked out entirely, refusing to be insulted by the superstitious ritual, which, for the host, may have revealed more than any interrogation. Some of the lanterns themselves were custom-made for the role. crafted with thin horn or glass panes designed to catch subtle changes in air. Some were even constructed with narrow vents that encouraged flickering under certain conditions, possibly by design. Whether this was manipulation or simply clever engineering depends on one's perspective. Interestingly, there are also records of lanterns being moved deliberately, shifted closer together, or adjusted to hang lower, depending on the household's current suspicions. A lord expecting dangerous company might tighten the spacing, ensuring more flames in close range of the guest's path. Or add one near the door that was never usually lit, just to see if anyone noticed. As centuries passed and architectural tastes changed, the practice faded. Candle chandeliers replaced individual lanterns. Halls grew broader, less enclosed. And the belief in flame as judge gave way to more direct means of control, guards, contracts, coded letters. But the lanterns remain, in scattered stories and surviving fixtures. In a handful of castles turned museums, you can still find them, thin chains dangling from ceiling beams, old oil bowls long dry. Some have no record of their purpose. Others, though, are marked in the margins of old blueprints or noted in guest accounts. Lantern Hall, passed through with care. We no longer believe that fire can detect lies. But we still understand the feeling. The sense that something subtle, something beyond speech, is aware. That in a quiet room, under the gaze of light and shadow, the truth may flicker out or flare bright. So next time you stand beneath a lantern, and its light dims suddenly for no reason, perhaps from a draft or a failing bulb, pause. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because someone once might have thought you had. The walls that remembered every step taken in anger. Imagine walking alone through a stone corridor lit by the dull flicker of a wall torch. The flames hiss quietly, casting a rhythm of gold and shadow along the walls. The air smells faintly of cold mortar, beeswax, and the lingering smoke of extinguished candles. Your footsteps echo softly beneath you, until they don't. You stop. But the sound continues. A second set of steps, distant, irregular, not loud, but unmistakably there. As though the castle remembers someone else's anger and is playing it back for you. Throughout medieval chronicles and household records, there appear strange, recurring descriptions. Thudding noises late at night, rhythmic and deliberate, always without source. Guards who swore they heard someone pacing above, only to find the chamber empty. Servants reporting soft footfalls echoing down spiral staircases where no one had passed for hours. These weren't ghost stories, at least not in the usual sense. They weren't tied to deaths or hauntings, but to tempers. Specifically, to tempers lost. Several chroniclers and domestic stewards describe the belief that certain castle walls and floors could retain emotion, particularly emotion expressed physically, through slammed doors, struck stone, or heavy, stomping footsteps. One clerk in a 15th century Burgundian household noted that the East Hall shakes still, though the Baron has long ceased his storming, adding that, nightly, it is as if his rage retraces itself. To modern ears, this may sound like superstition or metaphor, but in the context of medieval life, where buildings were not just shelters but moral spaces, reflecting order, hierarchy, and mood, it made a kind of quiet sense. Rooms were not neutral. They absorbed. They responded. They bore witness. Large castles, particularly those built of heavy stone and timber, often produced sounds long after motion had ceased. Wood contracted at night, iron creaked with cooling air. Stone, once warmed by bodies and fire, settled into new rhythms. These sounds could easily mimic footsteps, especially when filtered through the stillness of a late medieval night, when the only competing noise might be the wind scratching at shutters or the soft scurry of mice behind the walls. But the interpretation of those sounds, that was cultural. In a world where intent and consequence were deeply linked, and where few acts were truly private, the idea that stone could remember was not only poetic, it was moral. A reminder, a quiet form of accountability. In some castles, it was said that the most volatile rooms, those prone to arguments, judgments, or confessions, were the ones most likely to speak back at night. Not with words, but with subtle signs. A floorboard that tapped. A wall that pulsed softly. A thud where none should be. And always, it was believed, these were not random noises, but echoes. Traces, footsteps replayed as warning. A steward's record from Lincolnshire, dated to 1442, details an incident in which the master of the house, known for his quick temper, regularly stormed through the southern gallery. After his departure and subsequent death, staff reported a persistent tapping in that same corridor, always near the third archway. It didn't frighten them, but they avoided that part of the gallery after dusk. Not out of fear of spirits, but out of respect. These weren't tales of hauntings, then, but of character. The belief wasn't that souls lingered, but that emotion did. That stone, under pressure and force, held a memory, not of events, but of energy. Of how someone had moved through a space when they were most themselves, or perhaps least themselves. Interestingly, even the architectural design of castles supported this idea. Narrow staircases amplified sound. High ceilings allowed footfalls to carry and multiply. Timber floors creaked loudly under uneven weight. And stone corridors, particularly those with rounded ceilings, reflected noise back to the listener in strange, delay-ridden patterns. A stomp at one end of a hallway might repeat faintly seconds later at the other. These acoustic qualities, combined with the emotional intensity of castle life, power struggles, secrets, punishments, alliances, created an environment where tension didn't simply vanish when tempers cooled. It lingered, and when the castle settled at night, that tension re-emerged, not as speech, but as sound. In a few religious households, abbots even warned novices not to move through the cloisters in anger. Not for decorum alone, but because walls recall moods, as one rulebook gently phrased it. That in sacred spaces, even stone took notice of what passed before it. That to walk in fury was to leave behind a shadow. Whether taken literally or not, these stories shaped behavior. Children were taught not to slam doors. Knights and scribes were advised to cool tempers before crossing certain halls. Some spaces even developed reputations, not for being haunted, but for being emotionally loud. Places where arguments always felt closer to the surface. Where the weight of past footsteps could be felt, even if they could not be traced. And perhaps this belief, however unprovable, gave structure to something deeply human, the need to think of space as alive. As holding memory, not just of events, but of emotion. A castle was not merely stone and timber. It was a participant. It watched. It remembered. So tonight, if you find yourself imagining a medieval castle, the fire low, the halls quiet, the moon casting pale light through narrow windows, listen carefully. That faint tap you hear in the distance, it might not be footsteps, or wind, or wood. It might be the echo of a long-forgotten argument. A moment of anger that stamped itself into the very bones of the place. Not to frighten, not to punish, just to remind that even silence has memory, and some walls never quite forget. The gargoyles that winked when oaths were broken. Imagine yourself walking the upper ramparts of an old stone castle just before midnight. The wind curls around you, cool and whispering, carrying the distant crackle of a dying hearth and the faint clatter of horses in their stalls. The sky above is clear, the stars distant and pale. And lining the parapets on either side of you, perched in stony stillness, are the gargoyles, wide-eyed, grinning, gnarled figures carved centuries ago to guard against unseen forces. You pause beneath one of them. Its features are worn by rain and time. Crooked wings, a curled tail, a chipped ear. And yet, for a moment, you're not entirely certain it was looking in that direction before. Was the head always tilted like that? Did the mouth seem so smug yesterday? In certain castles of medieval Europe, legends persisted, quietly, and always with some hesitation, that gargoyles could move. Not freely, not in daylight, and certainly not with any dramatic flapping of wings. But with subtlety, at midnight, and only under very specific conditions. The most persistent of these tales claimed that if a guest of the household had broken an oath, whether sworn aloud or whispered in confidence, then one of the gargoyles would wink. Just once. To no one in particular. Or perhaps to the night itself. Accounts of such moments are rare in formal chronicles but surprisingly common in private letters, minor household records, and oral histories preserved among servants and stewards. They describe not entire statues coming to life, but a single blink, a twitch at the eye, and always witnessed alone, by someone too hesitant to speak of it loudly, lest they be mocked. The belief seems to have taken strongest root in the 13th through 15th centuries, when the symbolic weight of oaths was immense. In a world where written contracts were few and literacy uneven, a spoken promise, especially before witnesses, held sacred power. To break such a vow, whether of loyalty, silence, fealty, or marriage, was more than a personal failing. It was a moral rupture, a spiritual imbalance. And so, just as sacred oaths had saints and angels invoked to protect them, so too, it was believed, might there be watchers of stone to enforce them, not with punishment, but with exposure. The gargoyles themselves, originally placed for practical and symbolic purposes, were already deeply embedded in the medieval imagination. Their primary function was drainage, designed to funnel rainwater away from rooftops, preventing erosion of mortar and brick. But their secondary role was more mysterious. Their grotesque visages were thought to frighten off evil spirits, to mock the devil, or to serve as a visual sermon to the illiterate, a reminder that unholy forces lurked beyond the church walls. As such, when these same architectural guardians were positioned along castle parapets, especially on the homes of the nobility, they took on new layers of meaning. They weren't just monsters carved in stone. They were observers, fixed in place, and yet, somehow, never quite inert. Some households, especially those with long histories of internal betrayal, seemed to cultivate these stories deliberately. A nobleman whose cousin had once led a failed rebellion might instruct that a gargoyle be carved with one eye larger than the other. Another, whose steward absconded with coin, might request one with a tongue protruding in mockery. Over time, families began referring to specific gargoyles by name: the gloater, the liar's friend, the judge, and developed quiet rituals around them. Servants, when sweeping the ramparts, sometimes left tiny offerings at their bases: sprigs of dried herbs, bits of charcoal, or smooth stones. Not because they believed the gargoyle would grant them luck, but because they believed the gargoyle might tell them something the humans wouldn't. Stories were passed down among the kitchen staff and grooms. The steward's apprentice saw the gloater wink last Michaelmas, they'd say. And 2 days later, the visiting knight admitted he had wed another in secret. But no one ever saw the wink more than once. That, too, became part of the legend. If a gargoyle winked for you, it would never do so again. As if the stone itself had allowed a glimpse behind its mask, and having been seen, returned permanently to silence. Of course, it's easy to dismiss such stories as misremembered shadows, flickering torchlight, or tricks of fatigue. After all, most claimed sightings happened at night, often by those alone, and often by those half expecting something. A stable boy half frozen from his rounds. A kitchen maid returning late from the cellars. A young scribe too slow to retire after copying a letter. And yet the stories persisted. Even in castles where no actual gargoyle had ever been carved, tales would be transplanted, adopted, adapted. It was the idea that mattered, that somewhere, just above eye level, just out of reach, a watcher waited. Not to punish, but to mark. One noble family, in their household book, recorded a peculiar custom. Guests of the manor were escorted to the parapets on their first evening. It was framed as a chance to admire the view, to breathe the clean air. But it placed them beneath the gaze of the gargoyles. According to a marginal note, the family's steward would observe the guests quietly as they walked along the line of statues. One who dares not meet the gaze, it read, may carry a secret still cooling. As castle life changed in later centuries and stone guardians gave way to more restrained ornamentation, these stories faded. But some lingered in the architecture. In old estates now converted to museums or private homes, a visitor might still find an oddly placed figure watching over a terrace, with a crooked grin and one lid half lowered. And if you find yourself there, perhaps late at night, under clear skies and quiet eaves, and you think, just for a second, that one of them has moved, you won't be sure. You'll glance away, then back again. But if it happened, it was only once. And only for you. The chamber floors that sank under guilty feet, Imagine yourself arriving at a grand manor in the low hills of Brittany or the high stone halls of the Tyrol. The journey has been long, your boots are damp, and the smell of horses still clings faintly to your cloak. A steward greets you with polite silence and leads you into a large guest chamber. The walls are heavy with embroidered fabric, the hearth burns low, and the floor beneath your feet, wood, worn smooth by generations, creaks faintly as you step across it. Not unusually, just slightly. But then a thought stirs. Was that a creak or a sink? Did the board yield just a little more than expected? You pause, adjust your step, and walk on just a bit more carefully. Throughout medieval Europe and well into the early modern period, there circulated a curious superstition that certain chamber floors were built not just to support weight, but to judge it. Not the literal heaviness of a body, but the burden of its conscience. Guests, it was said, who carried guilt in their hearts would feel the floor subtly dip beneath them, just enough to unsettle, just enough to be noticed. These weren't trapdoors or mechanical tricks. No one fell through. There was no dramatic consequence. Just the quiet suggestion of being found out by something that couldn't speak, but still reacted. Records of this belief appear in scattered chronicles, often in the margins of estate ledgers, guest logs, or monastic journals. One 15th century account from a castle in Flanders describes a visiting magistrate who walked the chamber with steps like feathers, as though fearing the stones would accuse him. The steward of the house, observing this, noted it in the record not as complaint, but as confirmation. The floor remembered. It's unlikely that these floors were engineered to shift with judgment. More plausibly, uneven subfloors, warped timber, and slight settling over decades gave rise to strange sensations underfoot. And in an age where material quirks were rarely attributed to coincidence, the response was not curiosity, but moral interpretation. If your conscience felt heavy, and the floor bowed slightly, it was not the carpenter's fault, it was your own. In castles with known reputations for such floors, guests often altered their behavior. Chronicles and household letters mention individuals walking slowly, removing their shoes, or pausing between steps, as if lighter contact might preserve dignity. There is even mention in a 1492 Italian commentary of a merchant requesting to sleep in a chamber without the boards that know. These rooms acquired reputations over time. They were rarely identified publicly, but privately, among staff and regular visitors, they were referred to by names such as La Stanza della Verita, the Room of Truth, or Die Bake Tendile, the confessional floorboard. And whether or not the floors actually shifted, the idea of them created a behavioral effect. Those who believed in them seemed to become visibly more careful, cautious, and withdrawn. An early case, perhaps, of architecture influencing conscience. It's worth noting that the belief aligned well with the spiritual mindset of the age. In a world where divine judgment was thought to permeate every corner of life, where saints watched silently from altarpieces and relics were believed to radiate power, the idea that a floor might know your inner truth didn't seem so far-fetched. Conscience was not private. It was public, readable, even by wood and stone. In some estates, stewards reportedly used the floor's reputation to encourage honesty. A guest might be asked to swear an oath while standing in a particular chamber. If they shifted uncomfortably or tried to avoid placing full weight on the boards, some took that as a subtle confession. A quiet form of pressure, with no accusations made, just the weight of implication. Curiously, this tradition sometimes appears in religious settings as well. Some abbeys, especially in northern England and southern France, had confession rooms with uneven flagstones. These were attributed, over time, with selective sensitivity. A penitent who stood too long without kneeling might feel a coldness or shift underfoot, interpreted by the monks as divine prompting. Of course, flagstone settles unevenly over time, but for a man with heavy thoughts, that shift could feel like more than stone. One particularly interesting example comes from the preserved guest chamber at Schloss Strasburg in Austria. The floorboards there, original to the early 1500s, are slightly bowed in the center, worn thin by centuries of passage. Visitors today often note an odd sensation while standing still, especially near the hearth. The current caretakers make no claims. But a faded 17th century note in the household archive reads simply, "The guilty should not rest too long in the western wing." Whether psychological suggestion or sensory coincidence, the impact was real. A person who feared being discovered by a wooden floor likely already carried their secret uneasily. The room simply gave that feeling shape. And so, we're left with a tradition that's half superstition, half self-awareness. A reminder that for much of history, conscience wasn't thought of as a quiet internal murmur, but as something that could echo, ripple, and, perhaps, press gently downward. As you imagine now the hush of those long halls, the crackle of firelight, the soft tread of slippers on old planks, perhaps you too feel a subtle dip beneath your thoughts. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to wonder what the floor remembers. After all, the heaviest things we carry are often invisible. But some places still feel them.